Greetings, everyone. Greetings. I wanted to do something a little different. So this is going to be more of a podcasty kind of thing. You can't see me, and there are no other slides, so just listen. You can do it in the car. You can do it while you're cooking. I want to talk about some things. And I think that there are often some great ideas that are left out of the public discourse because the Overton window doesn't include them. And we'll go through what the Overton window is maybe someday. Not right now. We're very busy. Okay. So I think for the first topic, I want to talk a little bit about the big problem in America. What problem is that, you say? Well, I think if I were to say, what's the greatest problem in America? And we were having a conversation. I wasn't just sitting here talking to myself. But the number of answers would be pretty wide. And so I thought, well, what if we can come up with a solution without me knowing the problem? Well, that's impossible. Obviously, that's impossible. But just stay with me for a second here. What if we knew that the problems, all the problems, are connected to a single concept? What if every problem in America boils down to something? So I wanted to try a thought experiment where we try to see what is the cause of the big problem. And I'm not going to tell you what the big problem is. You're going to start with your own big problem. All right? I think that's the fairest way to do this. So, now that you have a problem, what you consider the biggest problem in America, I'm going to start by saying I don't think this is a bold statement. It's that our government is here to solve the biggest problems. So if it's a problem that is the biggest, the largest problem in America, then it's obviously the government's job to solve it. Or, conversely, if it is a problem created by the government, then simply need to stop doing that thing. It doesn't matter if this is an action or lack of action that creates the situation we're in. It doesn't change who's at fault. But let's just break down for a second how fixes happen, how the government governs, I guess. So we have bills, we have court decisions, we have executive orders, we have amendments, and that's all the federal government ways of doing big changes that could fix something big, right? But we also have the states. Now, if it's a big national problem, then I don't think we should be focused on the states. Not yet. We'll get there. But let's start with each one and talk about how things become a thing. We're not going to be doing Schoolhouse Rock here, trying to figure out how a bill becomes a bill, sitting on Capitol Hill, right? How are laws created? But it helps to think about it in those terms. So, for example, since we mentioned bills and laws, they pass both the House of Representatives and Senate, and then they go to the president. Assuming there's no crazy system, it's the three. Both parts of Congress and the president. Okay? Court decisions, obviously the Supreme Court of the United States. Executive orders, that's just the president. What about amendments? Well, that's more complicated, but basically it goes through both houses of Congress, and then it goes to the states themselves. So the states are in this, but I'm not talking about things that are unique to each state. If that's fair. All right. So, but let's go back a little further if we could. Is that all right? let's talk about, because it sounds like we have our answer. Well, the problem is Congress, the Supreme Court, and the president. Well, right, but like, we live in a democracy, don't we? So if we're trying to solve these problems, then we just have to say, well, how did these people become the people that make these decisions? How did they do it? And I know we're all cynical here. Remember, optimism, that's what's on the screen. So we're going to kind of not say the whole system's rigged. We're not going that way. I mean, legally, according to the actual system we have, it's a question of how do they do it. So, okay, fine. Let's try the president. Well, the president gets elected from actually the Electoral College, which isn't great at all. But how does the Electoral College get picked? I'm not talking about how do the members of the Electoral College, that boring stuff. I'm talking about how do we decide how many electorates each state gets? Because with the exception of a couple states, every state is winner takes all. Every state is winner takes all except for two, I believe, I'm not looking at it, Nebraska and Maine, which is great. But even still, we still have to decide, and we have, that states don't get the same number. So what is it based on? That number is based on the number of senators and the number of members of the House of Representatives. So representatives plus senators equals the Electoral College number. Now DC wants to raise its hand and say, actually, I get 3. You do. Absolutely, DC. You get as many as the lowest number for any state. It's a technicality that was offered to you. Even though you don't really have congressional representation the same way. So let's go back to the original idea. So we're back at Congress, and the only reason we brought that up was because the president's Electoral College number. But see, there's a problem here. If we think of the House of Representatives as being populace-based, right? The states with more people have more, and states with fewer have fewer, then it's quasi-fair. The problem is that every state gets 2 because of the Senate. I mean, we understand where it comes from. It's not crazy, but that means that the smallest state gets 3. And the largest state, it might get more, but those 2 are doing a lot for a small state. And to be clear, I'm not talking about physical size. We're talking about population. So that's why you get weird states like Wyoming, which has far fewer than 1 million people. I think it's sitting around 500,000 people right now. And you have a state like that, and they still obviously get 3. Well, that doesn't make sense if you look at larger states. Larger states don't get 3 electoral college votes for every 500,000 people. That's not how it works. Because in larger states, those extra senators don't do very much. Most of it comes from their House of Representative vote. So the skew actually helps smaller states have larger amounts of power. But if we want America to have even amounts of power distributed and the president to come from the people, then we seem to have hit a roadblock here. And it seems to be but not everything is about the president. So we shouldn't harp in on this one idea and say, well, we have the answer. It's the Electoral College. Well, no, hang on. The Electoral College has nothing to do with all those laws being passed or not passed. If Congress gets something stymied, we can't blame that on the Electoral College. That's not on them. We grabbed a genie out of a bottle and said, all right, no more Electoral College. And still Congress is not doing very much. It didn't solve all the problems, right? We need to make all the different routes to solve things better. So we can't just focus on one. All right, fine. What are some other ways? All right. Well, the Supreme Court, right? Court decisions should be more reflective of our population as a country. I think that's fair. I'm not saying that they need to just sway from public opinion, but it should be a little bit closer to what we actually believe as a people. And some of the problems have to do with how long you can stay on the bench forever. And some of it has to do with other mechanisms, right? So let's think about them for a second. Well, how do you become a Supreme Court justice? Well, that's easy. The president nominates somebody, and the Senate, well, that's who kind of approves them. And then they serve for life. And that's it. But hang on for a second. That's back to the Senate again. Well, then, I guess we start asking the question, if the Senate, the math of the Senate is what makes the Electoral College to be less democratic, right? And the Senate is the ones who get to prove the Supreme Court. It's seeming like, and I don't want to put too much out there, but it feels like the Senate is kind of the problem here. But before we go and say, boom, no more Senate, there are valuable things the Senate does. And I'm not saying that to be kind of snarky or anything like that. There is a real purpose. If you created a 5-year plan for the government and everybody's kind of on board, it's about infrastructure. You're going to build infrastructure, and everybody is kind of like, all right, this is not a bad thing. This isn't going to become a political thing. Everybody's just going to go for it. We'll fight on other things. And everybody's kind of on board, but 2 years later, a whole bunch of people get elected to the House, and they don't like this. And suddenly, our plan gets derailed. They want to pass a bill that stops this action. But the Senate has a lot of people who, because you serve 6 years in the Senate compared to 2 years in the House for each term, so they allowed to have a longer term vision. And I think that helps stabilize things. But it comes at a cost. And right now the cost is kind of high. Another analogy, because I don't have a time limit here, is fermented foods are very good for you. They're good for your gut bacteria. They're good for your health. Eating cultures as in the things that are alive, not going to museums. But museums are good too. But eating cultured food is very, very good for you. And so you say, well, that includes fermented foods. Absolutely, fermented foods are good for you. So beer. Beer is good for you? I just heard beer. Because beer is, well, that's checking the box. Well, but sugar is very bad for you. And so there's somewhere a line where the amount of sugar is so bad for you that it's not worth it to have the gut bacteria good stuff of a beer. And I think that's kind of where Senate falls for me, where it definitely is good to have two chambers that check and balance each other. I think that's very valuable. But right now, the Senate has this big fault, and that's that it favors small states, right? Wyoming has the same number of senators as California, and it's like, well, that's the great democracy. I mean, is it though? So we have a bit of a problem here. But even if you said, okay, well, I've got that genie again. I've got a genie, and I'm going to solve the problem. I've heard the problem. It looks like if I just no more genie, I want to get rid of the Senate. Well, I mean, okay, there are little problems with that, but the biggest problem is it doesn't actually solve everything. Okay, yeah, it solves some of the things, but it doesn't solve amendments. And if I'm going to waste a genie wish on American politics, which, okay, that's already a stretch, but if I'm going to do it, so genies are real, and I have a bunch of wishes, but not unlimited, and I'm going to give one wish to fixing American politics. Whew, probably not going to do that. And the reason is because the biggest problem we have so far is the one we haven't talked about. That there are a bunch of problems. And if there are a bunch of problems, we need a bunch of amendments. No one's going to get the craziest solve all into a single amendment. So let's talk for a moment about amendments. Okay? So amendments are pretty simple. I'm not saying they're simple to pass. I'm saying the concept is simple. This is the ultimate thing. This is the thing that changes everything else, right? It goes through a 2/3 majority in both houses, right? The House and the Senate. And then it goes to the states. Now, the states individually, in their respective legislatures, have to pass it. And how many states have to pass it? 3/4. Now, 3/4 is a lot. And a 2/3 majority in both the Senate and the House is a lot. Now, maybe getting rid of the Senate helps with that, but I don't know if that's what's hanging up our problem. And we do, just to be clear, have a problem here. The last amendment to be passed was in 1992. That's 32 years ago from when I'm right now. 32 years. It was 32 years ago that we passed the last amendment. If that doesn't sound like a long time, it really is. And here's why. If you go by how long it was between each amendment and the amendment before it, that is a long period of time. That's assuming we pass one right now. Okay? Right now, it's already been 32 years. Okay, but we've had longer gaps, right? Yes, and I looked them all up. So I can tell you the longest gap was between the 12th and 13th Amendment, which is 61 years. 1804 to 1865, 61 years. Okay, that's longer. I should just chill out. The second longest gap between the 15th and 16th Amendment was 1870 to 1913, 43 years. But of all the amendments, this is only the third longest gap. That's right. All the other gaps are shorter. And considering we have over 20 amendments, 27, according to my count, and there's something else I want to before I get sidetracked. There's also something about when an amendment gets proposed. So, I mean, I'm old enough to remember that amendment being passed, right, in 92. I just said that. But it was actually supposed to be part of the Bill of Rights. It was supposed to be one of those original amendments. So it was proposed in 1789. So, fine. If you were to say, how old would you have to be to have seen an amendment go through the entire process? From start to finish, from proposal to getting passed. Well, when was that? Well, that was 1971, when the 26th Amendment got passed. And it was proposed and passed the same year. Well, what was that? That's the one that changed the voting age to 18. Everything. So if you're not, what is that, 53 years old? If you're under 53, if you're like 52 years old, you're like, I'm not that bad. You do not remember an amendment ever going through the entire process from proposal. And the problem is, if you said, Well, what's the problem with that? We haven't had that many changes, but we have. America's changed so much. And even if you were to argue that, look, the Bill of Rights is fine, we don't need another Bill of Rights. Maybe we don't. Maybe we don't need another Bill of Rights. But the problem that we're facing here is that we are constantly trying to define the original Bill of Rights based on ancient language, centuries old. In the original Constitution. And all we need to do is make an amendment that clarifies a previous amendment. Why do you think we argue about certain passages so much? Because they were vague and we never went back and just passed an amendment to clarify. That's on this too. So it's, and all of the other technology, think about it, 32 years ago, what the heck was the internet? What was the internet? We have a lot of catching up to do when it comes to amendments, and amendments fix a lot of this. We don't need to worry about if the Supreme Court views things the way we think the contemporaries would view it if we just passed one now. So any solution that we come up with on this little podcast, sorry if I was getting a little heated there, doesn't count if it can't make amendments more connected to the people. And so this all boils down to what I consider, I know I've been winding up for 20 minutes now, what I consider the biggest problem. And that's that states are different sizes. I know, that seems just baked into the system, but it's why it's a problem of the Senate. It's why each of these is a problem. It's because California has so many more people than other states. You know, I saw a map that had the number of states that have a lower population than LA. And it's just nuts. But that's going to throw off the whole system. And okay, let's just take a second and think about kind of the problems big and small states have. And they're different. They're very different. And again, when I say big, I mean population. I know California and Texas are big in both ways, but states like Illinois is big in population. It's not physically large. On the other hand, Alaska is physically large, but its population isn't that impressive. So we're talking about population when we say big. Okay? All right. One of the problems that very populous states, see, I'm now changing my language to make it easier, very high population states have, is that not everybody lives in that urban environment. And so whether you're talking about New York City versus New York State, or Chicago versus Illinois, or the different parts of California, Texas, East Texas is very different. And Florida, it's Panhandle really isn't the same culture as going all the way down to Miami. They're different. And that's okay. They're allowed to be different. But the problem is, if I have to elect a governor to govern all of that, the governor absolutely of these states says, you know, I care about every inch of the state, every square inch. I absolutely care about all of it. Right, but somebody has to be the ones voting for this person. And if the person only convinces the largest urban spaces, they don't have to push very much for the rest of the state. See, that's a problem. It's a big problem. And I think that's a very different problem than what small states have. Because if you have a small population, you don't have this kind of, well, my problems are going to be very different than your problems, because your largest cities are still smallish. And a lot of your concerns are going to be about non-urban spaces. And that's all fine. I have no issue with any of this. But it means that a lot of your problems are going to be about things like brain drain and bringing resources to your state. If you want to have a big mall in a state that's population is very small, it's going to be hard to convince people to come there. You're constantly going to be fighting for tourism. You might not even have a railroad that comes through your state. If you do, you might get a stop that just happens to be in a straight line between two other bigger states. And that's really hard because you have a money problem. You have a resources problem. This goes for water resources. There's a whole bunch of different things. So fine, we're going to snap our fingers one last time, and we're going to make every single state exactly 2% of America. Oh no, don't do that. Oh, I did it. No, no, no. Because this creates just sheer chaos. Most states don't need to change their size. They're about the right size. It's only a problem when you start talking in extremes. Tiny little Wyoming, the Dakotas are really small, and California is just silly big. So I have a solution that I've been working on, but I don't want to bring it up now because we're already about 25 minutes in. So I'm going to sign off now and hopefully leave you with a good cliffhanger and some things to think about. All right. Have a good one, everyone. And in the next video, we'll go through my crazy idea. Remember, anything is worth considering here. All right.